production funding of Folks is made possible in part by membership contributions to Friends of Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to Folks. Tonight we continue our Black History Month series by taking a look at an event which changed the course of Louisiana history. Behind me is a Liberty Place monument which stands at the foot of Canal Street in downtown New Orleans. Most people don't even notice the monument, which sits in the middle of a traffic circle hidden by tall bushes. But a little more than 100 years ago, on September 14, 1874, a battle was fought here which was likened to the Revolutionary War. Near the turn of the century, this monument was erected to commemorate the members of the White League who died trying to oust the carpetbag rule. To understand what happened, we've dug out some history books and talked to several historians about the sequence of events which led up to the battle and why some people wish they had never taken place.
I think we have to begin in 1862 with the capture of New Orleans by the federal fleet. The Union forces never occupied all of Louisiana, but they did occupy New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and the adjacent areas. And one of President Lincoln's policies was to institute state governments in the Confederate States as rapidly as he could. This did not do away with the Confederate government, which was operating out of Opelousas and Shreveport. But it's the Union government, of course, since the Union won the war, that is recognized as the legal government.
The period following the Civil War is known in the South as Reconstruction. It was supposed to be a period to rebuild the war-torn and depressed states that had tried to leave the Union. It was also supposed to be the beginning of freedom for the millions of black men, women, and children who had been enslaved. During the war, the city of Baton Rouge and the Louisiana State Capitol building had been heavily damaged. As the Capitol was being repaired, state government was moved to New Orleans. The first few years following the Civil War found thousands of former slaves leaving the plantations and heading to the cities in hopes of finding a better way of life. Many Northerners were also heading for the southern cities to reap the spoils of war. The white landowners, businessmen, and politicians who had been in control of Louisiana before the war were being forced by the federal government to pay high taxes as punishment for their alliance with and sympathy for the Confederate cause. They were also forced to accept a new government that was dictated by Washington, D.C.
In 1867, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Acts, which provided for military occupation of the former Confederate states except Tennessee, and for the first time gave the right to vote to black adult males.
And in receiving the right to vote, blacks elected other blacks to office. Not only that, but blacks began to talk about how they could change society through the political realm. Not only blacks, but also liberal-minded whites from the South, who were later called scallywags, and certainly whites who had come into the South called carpetbaggers.
Louisiana politics during Reconstruction offered blacks full participation in government. The white society that once ruled Louisiana didn't accept the new way of life because they felt excluded from the decision-making process. The former Confederate politicians called themselves Democrats and band together against carpetbag rule that was supported by the Republicans.
The Republican Party in Louisiana was formed basically in late 65 and early 66. It had three parts: the white carpetbaggers, so-called, who had emigrated to Louisiana from the north; native Louisianians, usually called scallywags; native white Louisianians, usually called scallywags, who became Republicans. But the vast majority of Louisiana Republicans were black, the former slaves, and of course there were a great many people in Louisiana, black people, who had been free before the Civil War. They also were Republicans.
On September 3, 1868, a constitutional convention was held in Louisiana, which seemed to be the epitome of black suffrage. Half the delegates to the convention were black, and with their white counterparts passed two measures which seemed to predate civil rights by more than 100 years. One of the measures was the Bill of Rights, and it read, "All persons shall enjoy equal rights and privileges upon any conveyance of a public character, and all places of businesses or of public resort shall be deemed places of a public character, and shall be open to the accommodation and patronage of all persons without distinction or discrimination on account of race or color." The second measure was public education, and it read, "All children of this state shall be admitted to the public schools or other institutions of learning sustained or established by the state in common without distinction of race, color, or previous condition. There should be no separate schools or institutions of learning established exclusively for any race by the state of Louisiana."
Clearly, the liberalism of Reconstruction only is liberal when you compare it with the period that goes before and the period that comes afterward. And in that context, it was a tremendous change. As far as it being, total equality or anything of that sort, no, you're right, it wasn't.
Historians disagree over the amount of racial and social violence prior to and during the Constitutional Convention of 1868. Some say the Democrats were taking out their animosity toward the federal government on the black population.
I think it's impossible to avoid Reconstruction in general as anything other than a racial matter. Certainly race is a major factor within Reconstruction. The Democrats wanted to regain power for many reasons, simply, the benefits of power. But a large part of that was to maintain white supremacy. There's a tremendous desire on the part of these people to, as best they could, recreate society as it existed before the Civil War.
Perhaps the most controversial statement which came out of the Constitutional Convention was made by a man named P.B.S. Pinchback, who later became governor for 35 days. On this lithograph of the black delegates to the Constitutional Convention, it says that Pinchback rose to a question of privilege and said, "I want to tell them to beware. I want to tell them they have nearly reached the end of their string. The next outrage of this kind which they commit will be the signal for a dawn of retribution, a retribution for which they have not dreamed, a signal that will cause 10,000 torches to be applied to the city, for patience will then have ceased to be a virtue, and the city will be reduced to ashes." The white Democrats took this to be a direct threat to their well-being and didn't take Pinchback's comments very well.
In the first election under this Constitution, Henry Clay Warmoth, a very young, only 26 years old, former Union officer, was elected governor. He had been an enemy of General Grant's while he was serving in the Union Army, which didn't help him as governor of Louisiana, because in the fall of 1868, Grant was elected President of the United States. In that fall election, even though the Republicans had carried the state in April when Warmoth was elected, the Democrats won. They did that because an organization known as the Knights of the White Camellia so intimidated and some cases actually used violence against Louisiana Republicans that they didn't dare go to the polls.
The controversial elections of 1868 signaled a split in Louisiana's political structure, along with the blatant display of widespread corruption in government. But it also brought a unique form of government to Louisiana that has never been repeated. For 8 years during the turbulent years of Reconstruction, nearly 1/3 of the elected officials were black.
During Reconstruction in Louisiana from 1868 until about 1876, I found that there were roughly about 99 blacks, different blacks, who served in the House, not at the same time, but at various times during Reconstruction, and also about 24 blacks who served in the Senate. Now, these individuals came both from the former slave population and the former free population, and there was a tremendous amount of unity and agreement on programs out of these individuals. Among these individuals in the legislature, some of them took it upon themselves to push for certain programs. For instance, Robert Isabel, born in Opelousas and later moved to New Orleans, had been risen to the rank of corporal in the Army, was head of the education committee in the 1868 legislature, and he, along with his fellow committee members, kind of restructured the educational system in Louisiana. Now, one aspect of the elected officials that Louisiana is kind of unique in, and that is in the area of executive leadership. Louisiana has had 3 black lieutenant governors during Reconstruction. They had a black state treasurer that served for 10 years. His name was Antoine Duplessis, who was a former slave owner from Iberville Parish, had educated his 14 children, many of them in Paris, and there's no record that he participated on the Union or the Confederate side that I have found during the war. Okay, Oscar Dunn was the first black lieutenant governor in the state, served from 1860 until about 1871 when he died mysteriously in office, and he was even recognized by his political opponents as being a man that was incorruptible. He was destined, according to his biographers, Mr. Marcus Christian, the late Mr. Marcus Christian, late Mr. A.E. Perkins, to perhaps become governor. But he had an unblemished record, you see, and as lieutenant governor, he presided over the Senate. So,
what about his death? Does anybody really know what happened? Was that kind of
yeah, well, there's
mysterious?
Yeah, there are 2 interpretations. One said that he may have been poisoned because he was on his way to becoming governor, because the governor, a young man named Henry C. Warmoth, was a man that was rumored to have taken bribes and would certainly had a record that was worthy of note in terms of you would have to be very careful with his handling the money. And then there's another account that indicates that he may have died from just common, normal causes. Well, I guess Pinchback is the most noted of the individuals to come out of Reconstruction anywhere, basically because Mr. Pinchback, Pickney Benton Stewart Pinchback, an individual with such a name, would certainly elicit excitement, but because he operated with such a flair, he was elected a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1867. After that convention ended and the Constitution was adopted, he was elected state senator, you see. And after Dunn's death, it was kind of a unanimous feeling of the governor and the legislature that this man, Pinchback, would best give the governor the support that he needed from the black community. And he was an individual that the whites felt that they could work with also. So he was elected lieutenant governor by the legislature in a very, I guess, unusual evening, late afternoon session. He became lieutenant governor. And when the governor was impeached roughly about a year or so later, he rose to the position of governor.
White Democrats didn't see the new government as being a milestone in American history. As far as they were concerned, the government was illegal and the white people of Louisiana were being oppressed. The Democrats depicted and spread rumors about the Republican-run government that evoked shock and hatred toward those in office. Corruption and violence on both sides was so widespread, it was more or less accepted until the election of 1873, when William Pitt Kellogg became governor.
And the citizens, the businessmen, the community leaders, the doctors, lawyers, and merchants, and virtually the entire community felt that the incumbent authorities, which were supported by the federal bayonets, were taking totally unreasonable and unfair advantage of them.
However, the white people of Louisiana did not accept Kellogg as the legitimate governor. And outside of New Orleans, there was resistance to him on almost every hand. In '74, an organization was formed at Opelousas called the White League. It was dedicated to returning Louisiana government to white hands. The White League was very active in New Orleans. They were getting arms, surplus arms from the north, and drilling in a warehouse at night there. They even had some cannon. Well, the Metropolitan Police, under Kellogg's control, were commanded by General James Longstreet, who had been one of Robert E. Lee's corps commanders during the Civil War. And they learned about these arms coming in for the White League.
How were they coming in?
Mostly down the river. And they learned that there was a large shipment on a steamboat called the Mississippi, which had just anchored off the levee at New Orleans. And Longstreet was determined that the White League should not get these arms. So he took his Metropolitan Police, who were armed with artillery and Gatling guns, and drew up a line roughly from the foot of Canal Street, where the Liberty Place Monument is today, to Jackson Square, shutting the White League off from the river and the spot where the Mississippi was anchored.
And in a vein not completely unlike 1776, they revolted, and they made a plea to the President of the United States to restore the government to the local community.
The actual battle didn't last but about 10 minutes. The White League was able to outflank the Metropolitan line and rolled it up at the foot of Canal Street. And that night then, the rest of it evaporated because the people in the line could see that they didn't have a chance, so they nearly all went home. There were 15 White Leaguers and 13 members of the Metropolitan Police killed in the battle. I don't know how many wounded on each side. There were also, now 3 of the Metropolitan Police were black. Everyone else who was killed was white. There were 3 bystanders killed, 2 white and 1 black. But this left, very temporarily, the White League in control of New Orleans.
The business leaders, the professional men, the tradespeople, the druggists, the merchants, all virtually, without exception, supported what had happened. And they had petitioned President Grant to recognize this group as a duly constituted government of the city and the state. President Grant very properly replied immediately that this wasn't the way things should be done. You don't take the law into your own hands and return the government to the authorities who had been in control, which was done.
The very next night, federal troops who were stationed at Brookhaven, I believe at Brookhaven, Mississippi, somewhere in Mississippi, nearby, arrived by train. Kellogg, who had taken refuge in the custom house, was restored to the governorship, and things were pretty well like they were before.
The state's government never really did revert back to the way it had been before the Battle of September 14th, 1874. The White League had proved the Republican office holders had no real power. In 1877, another constitutional convention was held. The Democrats, most of them affiliated with the White League, were clearly the ruling body.
After the Democrats came back to power, it became a sort of mixed bag, if you will, that there were some movements back towards segregation. But what happens is that as the period continues, there becomes more solidity in this barrier, that the farther you move away from Reconstruction, the more that there is a definite line between white and black. And by the 1890s in Louisiana and throughout the South, segregation is becoming, rather than social custom, it's becoming written into the law. Certainly by the 19-teens and the 1920s, there's no question about the fact that Democrats dominated Louisiana and white supremacy was the rule. I would venture to say, if you studied Louisiana in the 1930s and early 1940s, race isn't really a question because it's a dead issue.
Most blacks who held office during the Reconstruction period were either intimidated to leave office or served until their term ran out. Black voters were becoming scarce as the segregation laws of the new era took hold. In 1898, the Liberty Place Monument was built at the foot of Canal Street, commemorating the White League's victory over the Metropolitan Police and federal government. 44 years later, a plaque was placed on the monument which read, U.S. troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election of 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state.
Well, this happens to be a pronouncement written in the 1930s. This represented the idea of some individuals. It didn't necessarily represent the ideas of the men involved in the original encounter at all, of course.
According to some historians, the tribute to white supremacy on the monument didn't accurately tell the truth about the Battle of Liberty Place. In his book, The Battle of Liberty Place, Stuart Landry wrote, "One of the reasons for the lack of knowledge about and the lack of interest in the terrible days of Reconstruction is a tendency of human nature to forget. Events crowd in upon us so that it is difficult to keep up with current history, and not much is printed today about the difficulties that beset the people of New Orleans during the tragic era." He said about race relations, "The Battle of Liberty Place was not a race riot or a struggle between whites and Negroes. It was the effort of freedom-loving Americans to throw off the shackles of a dictatorship of sordid politicians illegally elected and holding office with the aid of federal bayonets. As such, it deserves more than passing consideration, for it was evoked by a desire for freedom, liberty, and justice, and the motive was a patriotic one."
A proclamation was put out by the leaders of this revolt, and they said very simply, and I'll just read a copy. It's dated September the 14th, 1870, and it's entitled, "To the Colored People of the State of Louisiana. In the grand movement now on foot against the enormities of the rule and usurpation you have suffered, rest assured that no harm is meant to you, your property, or your rights. Pursue your usual avocations, and you will not be molested. We war against thieves and plunderers and spoliators of the state who are involving your race and ours in common ruin."
Did anybody ever come out in 1930 and say, well, I don't think that we should put this on the monument because that wasn't the true intent of our forefathers?
No. There was no indication that anyone objected.
During the first half of the 20th century, race relations were more or less taken for granted. It wasn't until the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that blacks started to publicly admit that they were personally offended by the monument and its sentiment. In 1976, James Duffy, then Deputy Director of the Human Relations Commission, City of New Orleans, wrote a memo to council members. In it, he said, in the early 70s, there was some talk of either demolishing the monument or adding a clarifying statement to it. In June 1974, a plaque was placed at the foot of the monument, noting that the sentiments expressed by the 1932 edition did not reflect the thinking of present-day Arlenians. Duffy went on to say, "It has been the position of the Landry administration that it does not favor removal of the monument, nor does this administration feel that it has the authority to do so." Duffy continued, "It is my personal belief that the monument adequately expresses the feelings of white Arlenians in the late 19th century and first half of the 20th. I do not favor the monument's removal as it serves as a constant reminder of the racism that once plagued the city and the progress that has been made to eradicate it."
Monuments are very real reflections of what has happened. And to understand what has happened, you have to preserve these examples, good or bad. You can't go through your history and erase the things that were perhaps not becoming.
During the end of 1980 and the beginning of 1981, the controversy over the monument started all over again. Mayor Ernest Morial, the first black mayor of New Orleans, had indicated that he wanted the monument removed. We tried to talk to Mayor Morial about his position, but he refused the interview, saying that the interview could have an impact on the mayoral election now in progress.
So it was felt then as it's felt today by a large part of the community that you shouldn't try to erase the truth that happened in the past.
And the fact is that the monument represented something to an element of people who are on the face of it racist, and in fact who felt that the monument alone was not enough, that they wanted to put a plaque on it to make it clear that this was a monument to white supremacy. And the fact is that at the present time, they, following out of what the people who put the plaque on it did, they made it part of the city property. So it's not just a matter of history, it's an ongoing, everyday affair that is maintained and paid for by all of the taxpayers.
The city council declined to take the monument down. The city council felt it should be preserved. And this is the government of the city of New Orleans.
You don't think that pressure from individuals like you who had a parent actually involved with the battle did influence these people to think that this monument should be kept?
Well, I think 7 men on a governmental body react to what they conceive are the wishes of the population. That's what they're there for.
All of those arguments evade the central point, and the central point is that the city is 55% black, and the majority of black people would rather that it not be there. However, the real problem is that the white supremacists are still in control of the city mechanism, even though you have titular blacks in positions, so that the mayor will tell you his hands are tied. There's nothing he can do about the statue. He tried to get it removed, but he couldn't do it. You have 3 blacks on the city council. They don't even want to even deal with it. You know, I mean, they want to evade the issue, and the whole issue is one of power. And the white supremacists know as long as they can maintain that statue there on city property with city funds, then they are in fact have a measure of power over the city.
The issue has gotten extremely personal with groups for and against the monument. During 1981, there were several verbal attacks between blacks who wanted the monument off city property and whites who wanted it to remain.
Get out! You cannot move me from here! You cannot move me from here!
What happened next was right out of the movies. Duke and his monument protesters were surrounded by the police brutality protesters, and in a strange twist, protest and counter-protest took on the air of a pep rally.
Down with racism! Down with racism! Down with racism!
After 30 minutes, Duke then tried an end run out of the circle and up Canal Street. It didn't work.
Down with racism! Down with racism! Down with racism!
When that didn't work, Duke tried to break off the confrontation by ordering his group to a halt. That also failed.
Every time you show up at the statue, we will be there to deny it to you.
Now, it was made a center of controversy by these 2 groups who, without question, don't really understand the history and the background involved. The NAACP felt that it was insulting to them. But I think if we spend some time with them and explain to them the real purposes and showed them a copy of the proclamation where this was not a racial incident at all, that no action was directed against the black community, and as a matter of fact, it said this is to preserve the rights of all of us, I think they would change their idea.
Secondly, nobody's saying destroy history. Nobody's saying, you know, destroy the monument. We're simply saying it should not be maintained by public funds. It should not be maintained by the city. The issue of race is not what it's about. It's the issue of power, political and economic power. That's what the real question is.
Today, a piece of stone has been placed across the offensive words. It looks as though both sides got what they wanted. The monument is still here, and the offensive words to white supremacy have been covered. But people say that there is still a controversy existing in New Orleans and that the battle isn't over yet. Perhaps the best suggestion to try and clear up the controversy has been probably to build another monument next to this one commemorating the Metropolitan Police and civilians who died during the Battle of Liberty Place.
Production funding of Folks is made possible in part by membership contributions to Friends of Louisiana Public Broadcasting.